Hello everyone, I'm very glad that you're joining this story. Subscribe, like and comment. Enjoy the story, smile more often.
The smell of burnt burgers and cheap whiskey filled the air as I stood by the back fence, nursing a lukewarm beer and trying not to look too much like I hated being there. Uncle Rick was flipping another batch of overcooked patties on the grill while Aunt Linda fluttered around the yard, clinking glasses and beaming like she had just personally solved world hunger. A giant white banner hung between two sad-looking oak trees, sagging slightly in the middle, screaming in bold red letters, "Congratulations, Evan." It was the kind of scene that looked picture-perfect from the outside, but if you stayed long enough, the cracks in the family porcelain became too big to ignore. Everyone was there, which was rare these days, the cousins who usually found excuses to miss holidays, the aunts and uncles who claimed to be too busy, even Nana June, who rarely left her house unless it was for something important like this. Evan was the hero of the hour, standing tall in the center of it all, soaking up every bit of attention like he was born to it. He had just gotten into medical school, and the entire family acted like he had been crowned King of America. The way they talked about him, you would think he was about to single-handedly cure cancer while teaching blind children to read Braille in his spare time. I lingered on the sidelines, clutching my beer like a lifeline, watching everyone fall over themselves to toast to Evan's greatness. My announcement, the one I had been rehearsing in my head for days, burned a hole in my chest. Harvard Law. 3 little words that should have meant something. Should have been enough. I had imagined the moment 100 different ways, the hugs, the backslaps, the "we always knew you could do it" kid speeches. Instead, when I finally cleared my throat and said it, voice steady but heart racing, it barely made a ripple. I think it took a full 10 seconds before anyone even turned their heads. There was a moment of blank silence, like I had said something in a foreign language before the polite clapping started. It was the kind of clapping you might give a toddler who just managed to stack 3 blocks without drooling on them. Aunt Linda, God bless her, took it a step further. She laughed. Not a cute little chuckle. A full, rich laugh, loud enough that people turned to look. "That's cute," she said, waving her wine glass in a lazy circle. "But Evan's going to be a doctor." The words hit harder than I expected. Harder than they should have. I swallowed the lump forming in my throat and forced a smile because that's what you do when your own family thinks your greatest achievement is a punchline. I could have let it go. Could have laughed it off like I had 1,000 other little slights over the years. But not tonight. Tonight, I had come prepared. I slid my hand into the inside pocket of my blazer, the one I almost didn't wear because it was too hot for a jacket, and pulled out a neatly folded letter. Without a word, I walked up to Aunt Linda, ignoring the puzzled looks, and placed it gently into her free hand. She took it without thinking, laughing again, like this was some kind of joke she was already in on. But as her eyes skimmed the first few lines, the laughter died in her throat. Her face changed slowly, like a sinking ship going under inch by inch. First, the smile faltered. Then the corners of her mouth twitched downward. Finally, her hand holding the wine glass trembled just enough that a few drops sloshed onto the patio stones. She didn't say a word, but she didn't need to. The silence around us grew thick, sticky, uncomfortable. Evan, still basking in his glory, hadn't even noticed yet. I leaned in close enough that only she could hear me and said, very softly, "Congratulations, Aunt Linda. Looks like we're both going to make headlines this year." Then I stepped back, letting the letter fall from her slack fingers onto the ground. For the first time that night, all eyes were on me, but not with admiration or pride. No, this was different. This was confusion. Fear. Maybe even a little respect, the kind you give someone you suddenly realize you don't know as well as you thought you did. And for the first time in a long time, I felt something crack open inside me, not anger, not bitterness, but a cold, clean satisfaction. It was not the celebration I had wanted, but damn if it wasn't the moment I had needed. There is something almost surgical about the way a moment like that cuts through years of build-up resentment. Like a knife, slicing through the fatty layers of pretense and polite smiles, leaving nothing but raw, exposed truth. I didn't know it then, but that letter would change everything. Not just for Aunt Linda. Not just for Evan. For all of us. And if you think that's petty, maybe it is. Maybe part of me wanted to see her sweat. Maybe part of me wanted everyone to see that under all the trophies and bragging rights, this family wasn't as picture-perfect as they pretended to be. Hell, maybe part of me just wanted to finally be seen. But nothing good ever comes clean, does it? Every action pulls something else out of the shadows. Every decision is a stone tossed into water, sending ripples you can never really control. What do you think? Was I wrong to do it? Or was it about damn time someone like Aunt Linda got a taste of her own medicine? Tell me your own stories. I bet a lot of you out there have an Aunt Linda in your life too. Because trust me, this was just the beginning. When I was a kid, it was obvious to everybody who the golden child of the family was, even if nobody ever said it out loud, at least not in front of me. From the time Evan could walk, people treated him like he had a spotlight following him around, and the rest of us were just part of the stage furniture, extras in a show that was all about him. Family gatherings always had that same rhythm. Evan would do something barely worth mentioning, score a point at a soccer game, recite the Pledge of Allegiance without stumbling, and the room would erupt like he had just won the Nobel Prize for Physics. Meanwhile, if I so much as brought home a good report card, the best I could hope for was a distracted "good job, buddy," while Uncle Rick asked Evan to tell everyone again about how he almost made varsity as a freshman. Christmas was probably the worst because it laid everything out in plain sight, a cold ledger of who mattered and who didn't. Evan would tear through a mountain of gifts, the newest game systems, top-of-the-line sports gear, designer clothes he barely wore, while I unwrapped another set of socks or a $10 bookstore gift card, pretending not to notice the difference. I still remember the Christmas when I was 12 and Evan was 13. He got a brand new dirt bike, shiny red and black, while I got a used board game missing half the pieces. The worst part wasn't even the presents. It was the way nobody seemed embarrassed about it, the way they all acted like it made perfect sense that Evan deserved the world, while I was lucky to get the crumbs. It wasn't that I hated Evan, not really, not at first anyway. Evan was one of those kids who was easy to like if you didn't have to live in his shadow every single damn day. He was good-looking in that all-American, movie poster way, with a square jaw and a smile that could talk a cop out of giving him a ticket. He was good at just about everything he tried, too: soccer, basketball, swimming. Hell, he even picked up the guitar for a few months and managed to be halfway decent at it. If life were a movie, Evan was the star quarterback who also got straight A's and volunteered at the animal shelter on weekends. And me? I was the guy standing behind him, holding his damn water bottle. I spent years trying to figure out if I was invisible because Evan was so bright, or if I was invisible because nobody ever bothered to look at me in the first place. It's funny, the way you start lowering your own expectations when the people around you do it first. At first, I tried harder, thinking if I just worked a little more, pushed a little further, they'd see me. I joined the debate team, won a few local competitions, brought home certificates that I taped to the fridge myself because no one else seemed to think it mattered. I took extra AP classes, stayed up late studying while Evan was out getting cheered on at his latest soccer match. I figured if I stacked up enough wins, eventually they'd have to notice. They didn't. If anything, it just seemed to annoy them, like I was making things harder than they needed to be. Aunt Linda, queen of backhanded compliments, once said at Thanksgiving, "Jack's our little bookworm, aren't you, honey? Maybe one day you'll write about Evan's adventures." She said it with that syrupy voice people use when they're patting a dog on the head for doing a trick. The whole table laughed like it was the funniest thing they'd ever heard, and I laughed too, because what the hell else was I supposed to do? Over time, I stopped trying to win their approval and started trying to outrun it instead. I picked a college 3 states away, somewhere nobody had even heard of unless they squinted at a map for a while. I figured if I couldn't be their star, maybe I could at least be free. but even then, Evan was everywhere. I'd come home for holidays, and there he would be, front and center, dazzling everyone with stories about med school applications and internships, while I quietly muttered something about law school under my breath and refilled my own damn coffee cup. The funny thing is, it wasn't even Evan's fault most of the time. He wasn't malicious, he wasn't cruel. He was just the kind of guy who assumed the world worked in his favor because, for him, it always had. Evan wasn't the disease, he was just the symptom. The real infection ran deeper into the way our family measured worth, the way they weighed success like gold on a scale and decided who was valuable and who wasn't. It's easy to say, now, that it shouldn't have mattered so much, that I should have just focused on my own path and let them have their little worship sessions. But when you're a kid, and the people who are supposed to love you no matter what seem to love someone else a little more, or maybe just a little louder, it gets under your skin in ways you don't even realize until you're older. Until you wake up one day and realize you've been running a race you never signed up for, and the finish line keeps moving just out of reach. I can still remember the first time I really thought, that maybe one day I'd beat him at something. I was 15, sitting on the cold bleachers of Evan's championship soccer game, watching him score the winning goal with the kind of effortless grace that seemed almost cruel. The crowd went wild, the coach hoisted him onto his shoulders, and Aunt Linda screamed herself hoarse from the sidelines. I sat there, arms crossed, heart pounding, and thought, just wait. Just wait until I find something you can't kick a ball through. Just wait until the playing field isn't tilted so far in your favor that you can score by accident. I didn't know what it would be yet. I didn't know how long it would take. But somewhere deep inside, a tiny spark flared to life, stubborn, angry, determined, and it never really went out after that. It would smolder quietly for years, fueled by every offhand comment, every overlooked achievement, every Christmas morning that felt more like a tally of who mattered and who didn't. And when it finally ignited, when it finally caught fire, it would burn hotter and brighter than anything Evan Monroe, golden boy, family favorite, future doctor, could ever hope to extinguish. The grind was the kind of thing nobody talks about at family dinners, the endless hours spent hunched over a second-hand desk in a one-bedroom apartment that smelled like mildew no matter how much cheap air freshener I sprayed around. There were nights when the loneliness in that place got so loud it felt like it pressed down on my chest, when the only sounds were the scratch of my pen against practice essays or the slow ticking of the clock that hung crooked above the door. Law school was supposed to be the next step, the next big thing that would finally earn me some kind of respect, but getting there felt less like climbing a ladder and more like clawing my way up the side of a cliff with bloody fingers and broken nails. While Evan was being handed glowing letters of recommendation and endless encouragement, I was stitching together my applications out of sheer stubbornness and a deep, gnawing need to prove something, even if I wasn't entirely sure who I was trying to prove it to anymore. I scraped together money for application fees by picking up shifts at a local diner, serving burnt coffee to grumpy old men who called me kid like it was an insult. I spent weekends volunteering at a legal aid clinic downtown, watching broken families and desperate people shuffle through the system like cattle, wondering how many of them ever really stood a chance. No one in my family ever asked how it was going. No one offered to read my personal statement or even pretended to care whether I made it into a decent school. When I mentioned I was applying to Harvard, Aunt Linda actually laughed over the phone, one of those short, sharp laughs that slice through you before you even realize you've been cut. "Well," she said, in that syrupy voice I hated more than any outright insult, "aim high, honey. No shame in dreaming big." I could almost hear the smirk through the receiver. I didn't tell them about the nights I sat staring at blank pages until 2 in the morning, the rejection emails that started piling up before the acceptances even had a chance to trickle in, the way I sometimes thought about giving up just to spare myself the humiliation of failing in front of the people who were already half expecting it. I didn't tell them about the anxiety attacks that left me curled up on the floor of that crappy apartment, gasping like a fish on dry land, too proud to call anyone for help. Pride was a heavy thing to carry, but it was the only damn thing that felt like mine. The day the letter came, it almost got lost in a stack of bills and junk mail, a plain white envelope that didn't look nearly important enough to change my entire life. I almost didn't open it right away. I remember tossing the pile onto the kitchen table and staring at it for a long moment, feeling that sick churn in my stomach that always came with opening mail those days, like maybe it was just another rejection, another door slamming shut in my face. The room felt too small, the air too stale. I turned on the tiny, battered fan that sat in the corner, but it didn't help. When I finally tore open the envelope with shaking hands, I didn't read the letter right away. My eyes caught on the words at the top, "We are pleased to inform you," and for a second, the world tilted sideways. I sat down hard in the nearest chair, the letter slipping from my fingers to the table, and just stared at it, heart hammering against my ribs like it was trying to break free. Harvard Law. I had gotten into Harvard Law. There was no one there to see it, no one to scream or cry or hug me until we both collapsed laughing. No champagne popped, no proud parents threw a surprise party, no family gathered around to hear the news. It was just me and the peeling paint on the walls and the damn fan whirring uselessly in the corner. I sat there for a long time, feeling the weight of it, the size of it, the enormity of what I had done completely on my own. I had built something from nothing, clawed it out of the dirt with bare hands, and nobody could ever take that away from me, no matter how hard they tried to ignore it. Eventually, I stood up, still holding the letter like it might disappear if I let it out of my sight. I walked to the tiny kitchen, pulled a dusty bottle of cheap whiskey out of the cabinet, and poured myself a shot. The liquor burned all the way down, but I didn't care. I lifted the glass in a silent toast to the empty room, to the battered table, to the cracked window that rattled whenever the wind blew. To me, I said aloud, voice rough but steady, to doing it without any of you. Maybe it was petty, but I thought about Aunt Linda then, about Evan and the way the whole family orbited around him like he was the goddamn sun. I thought about all the times they made me feel small, invisible, like the best I could hope for was to be a footnote in someone else's story. I thought about every time they had laughed, doubted, dismissed. I folded the letter carefully, slid it back into the envelope, and tucked it away in the drawer next to my bed. I didn't tell anyone right away. Part of me wanted to hold it close for a while, keep it mine before the world got its hands on it, and tried to make it about something else. Before they tried to minimize it, explain it away, make it smaller so it wouldn't threaten the fragile little stories they had built about who mattered and who didn't. That night, I fell asleep with the letter under my pillow like a kid hiding treasure from thieves. And maybe that's exactly what it was, not just a piece of paper, not just an acceptance, but proof that I was more than they ever let me believe. Proof that I could build a life on my own terms, whether they ever saw it or not. Because this time, I wasn't just playing to be noticed. I wasn't chasing their approval anymore. I was coming for everything they said I couldn't have, and I wasn't planning on asking permission. The backyard was decked out like a cheap wedding, folding chairs sinking into the patchy grass and balloon bouquets tied to the old chain-link fence that rattled every time the wind picked up. The smell of overcooked hot dogs and warm beer floated heavy in the air, mixing with the sharp bite of freshly cut grass and something sour I couldn't quite place, but figured was just the inevitable stench of 100 fake smiles and backhanded compliments. Evan stood near the center of it all, holding court like some kind of hometown hero, his new white coat draped casually over one arm as if he were posing for a catalog cover instead of attending a family barbecue. People buzzed around him like flies at a picnic, cooing over the invitation to his white coat ceremony as if it were a royal summons, passing it around like it was a sacred relic that might bless them with second-hand greatness. Aunt Linda beamed brighter than the goddamn sun, clapping her hands every time someone asked Evan to tell the story again about how he nailed his interviews, how the professors had practically fallen over themselves to welcome him into the fold. It was the same tired song, just sung louder, and with a bigger stage this time. I stood near the edge of the patio, nursing a warm beer and watching it all unfold with a kind of detached numbness that was becoming far too familiar. I had rehearsed my announcement in my head 100 times on the drive over, picturing different ways it could go, some big, dramatic reveal that would finally make them stop and see me. I had even imagined Aunt Linda dropping her wine glass in shock, Evan clapping me on the back and saying he always knew I had it in me. Stupid fantasies, all of them. When I finally found a break in the noise, a small lull in the endless stream of Evan worship, I cleared my throat and stepped forward, heart hammering in my chest like I was standing in front of a firing squad instead of my own damn family. I kept it simple, direct, because I knew better than to expect them to connect the dots. I said the words I had dreamed of saying for so long, voice steady but quiet enough that I had to repeat them once to be heard. I got into Harvard Law. For a second, there was silence, a real silence that cut through the party noise like a blade. Heads turned, conversations faltered, even the flies seemed to pause mid-buzz. And then came the polite clapping, the kind you give a 6-year-old who just managed to tie his shoes. It lasted maybe 3 seconds before people turned back to Evan, back to the safe, familiar story they knew how to celebrate. And then Aunt Linda, God bless her twisted little heart, let out a laugh so sharp and loud that half the patio turned to look. She covered her mouth with one hand, trying to act like it was just a harmless chuckle, but the damage was already done. She waved her wine glass toward me, her voice thick with condescension as she said, "That's cute, Jack. Really cute. But Evan's going to be a doctor." The words hit harder than any punch to the gut could have, a casual dismissal that carried the full weight of years of being second best, years of being the afterthought. I felt the heat crawl up my neck, the bitter taste of humiliation burning the back of my throat. For a moment, I thought about just walking away, about swallowing it down like I always had, telling myself it didn't matter because I knew my worth even if they didn't. But not this time. I slid my hand into the inside pocket of my jacket, fingers closing around the thick envelope I had brought with me, the one piece of ammunition I had kept in reserve just in case things went exactly the way they were now going. I crossed the patio in 3 long strides and handed it to her without a word, locking eyes with her for just a second before stepping back. She took it automatically, still laughing under her breath, until she unfolded the letter and started to read. I watched the transformation happen, slow and ugly, as the blood drained from her face and her smile froze into something brittle and cracked. She read it once, twice, and then a 3rd time, as if the words might change if she stared at them long enough. Around us, the party noise faded into a low, confused murmur. Evan finally noticed something was wrong and drifted over, eyebrows knitting together as he asked what was going on. Aunt Linda opened her mouth, closed it, opened it again, but no words came out. She looked at me, really looked at me for the first time in years, and for once there was no smugness in her eyes, no pity, no superiority, just fear. I leaned in close enough that only she could hear me and said, "Congratulations, Aunt Linda. Looks like you're going to need a good lawyer." And then I walked away, the beer still in my hand, the sun setting behind the sagging banner that screamed congratulations for someone who had never needed to fight for anything in his life. Have you ever worked your ass off for years, only to have the people you love treat it like a joke? Tell me your story in the comments, because damn, it burns. It burns in a way that never really goes away, a slow, simmering anger that lives just under the skin, flaring up every time you hear another backhanded compliment. Every time you watch someone else get praised for breathing while you're bleeding yourself dry just to keep up. I didn't look back as I crossed the lawn, didn't give them the satisfaction of seeing whether I was hurt or angry or anything else they could use to dismiss me. I had delivered my blow, clean and surgical, and now it was up to them to figure out how deep it had cut. But deep down, under the anger and the satisfaction and the lingering hurt, I knew this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. You don't shatter the delicate glass of family lies without expecting the shards to cut you on the way down. And as I climbed into my car and slammed the door behind me, I realized something I hadn't let myself think before. I hadn't just declared war. I had already won the first battle. The envelope in Aunt Linda's hand looked almost innocent, just a plain white rectangle trembling slightly between her manicured fingers, but I knew that inside it, tucked neatly between heavy cardstock and precise legal language, was the match that was about to set her perfect little world on fire. The silence that had fallen over the backyard grew thicker with every second she spent reading, her eyes darting frantically over the words like she might somehow misinterpret them, like she could will a different meaning into existence if she stared hard enough. But there it was, in black and white, clear as the stain starting to bloom on her carefully curated reputation. Her mouth opened slightly, a faint gasp slipping out before she clamped her lips shut again, and for a moment, she just stood there frozen, like a deer caught in the blinding headlights of a truck she never saw coming. Around us, the party noise faltered, the fake laughter and clinking glasses slowing into a confused murmur, as though everyone could sense something had cracked, even if they didn't understand yet what it was. I didn't say a word, didn't offer any explanations or soften the blow, because after all the years of being brushed aside, laughed at, treated like a footnote in my own family, I figured she could sit in the discomfort for a while without me rushing to rescue her. Aunt Linda, who always had a witty comeback or a sharp little barb ready, was now completely speechless, and watching her struggle to summon words was more satisfying than I ever could have imagined. Her hand dropped slightly, the letter drooping toward the grass, and I could see the way her carefully constructed facade was starting to crumble at the edges. There was fear in her eyes now, real fear, the kind you can't fake or hide, and seeing it there was like inhaling pure oxygen after years of breathing smog. Still, I knew better than to let the satisfaction show on my face, because if there was one thing Aunt Linda was good at, it was spinning weakness into an attack, and I wasn't about to give her any ammunition. As the silence stretched painfully long, my mind drifted backward, pulled without warning into the memory of how all of this had started. The real reason she was standing there with her mouth hanging open and her glassy eyes wide with panic. It had been almost a year ago, though it felt like a lifetime, when I first stumbled across the mess she had made, almost by accident, in the dusty corner of a case file I wasn't even supposed to be looking at. I had been interning at a mid-sized law firm downtown, mostly fetching coffee and organizing files, the kind of grunt work no one ever thanks you for but everyone expects you to do with a smile plastered on your face. Late one night, after most of the office had emptied out and the cleaning crew was clattering their trash bins down the hall, I had stayed behind to help a junior partner prep for a meeting. I was sifting through a stack of documents when I saw her name, Linda Monroe, printed neatly at the top of a property management contract. Curiosity had flickered, just for a second, enough to make me set aside the pile I was working on and read a little closer. What I found, as I pieced together lease agreements and maintenance records, wasn't just a few sloppy mistakes or overlooked fees. It was a systematic pattern of shady dealings that reeked of fraud. Inflated maintenance charges billed to low-income tenants, security deposits that mysteriously vanished, forged signatures on inspection reports, all tucked away under layers of paperwork so tedious and bland that most people would have missed them entirely. At first, I wanted to believe it was a mistake, some kind of clerical error that could be explained away with a few apologies and a stern warning. But the deeper I dug, the uglier it got, and by the time I brought it to the attention of the partner overseeing the case, there was no longer any room for doubt. Aunt Linda had been screwing people over for years, lining her pockets at the expense of people who could barely afford to keep a roof over their heads. The lawsuit came together faster than I expected, propelled by the sheer weight of evidence and the rage of the tenants who had been cheated out of their money and their dignity. I wasn't supposed to be involved once the official filing happened. Interns don't get to sit at the big kids' table when the real work starts, but Mr. Carson, the senior partner, pulled me aside and told me flat out that he wanted me on the team. "You found it," he said, leaning back in his leather chair with a shark's grin. "You finish it." And now here we were, standing in the ruins of what was supposed to be another golden day for the Monroe family. while Aunt Linda clutched the letter that told her in no uncertain terms that she was being sued for damages that could wipe out everything she had spent years building. If she lost, and from where I was standing, the odds of her winning looked about as good as a snowball's chance in hell, she would be financially gutted, her reputation in shreds, her carefully curated image as the perfect matriarch permanently shattered. Evan was still hovering nearby, glancing between us with mounting confusion, sensing that something seismic had shifted but too slow to put the pieces together. He reached for the letter, but Aunt Linda yanked it away instinctively, clutching it to her chest like it might shield her from the blow that had already landed. When she finally managed to speak, her voice was thin and brittle, a far cry from the booming confidence she usually wielded like a weapon. "Jack," she whispered, the name barely audible over the buzz of the party, trying desperately to return to normal. "Jack, you don't understand. This isn't what you think." But the thing was, I understood perfectly. I understood more than she ever wanted me to. I understood that she had spent years building a life on the backs of people she thought were too powerless to fight back. I understood that she had laughed in my face when I told her about Harvard Law because, deep down, she believed I would never be anything more than the family punchline. And now, standing there as the sun dipped lower and the backyard lights flickered on one by one, casting long, uneasy shadows across the grass, I understood something even deeper, that justice, real justice, doesn't always come in grand gestures or sweeping declarations. Sometimes it comes in a quiet moment, a single folded letter, and the look on the face of someone who finally realizes that the rules have changed, and they are no longer holding the winning hand. Long before the envelope ever touched Aunt Linda's hand, long before the lawsuit took shape like a storm gathering on the horizon, I wrestled with the decision in the kind of way that keeps you awake at 3 in the morning, staring at the ceiling and wondering if you are the bad guy in someone else's story. It would have been easier to say it was about revenge, to wrap it all up neatly in that word and move on without second-guessing, but the truth, the messy and uncomfortable truth, was that it went deeper than that. It wasn't just about me. It wasn't just about being overlooked or laughed at or treated like I was less than the dirt on Evan's cleats. It was about what Aunt Linda had done, the lives she had hurt, the people she had crushed under the weight of her greed, while the rest of us clapped along like fools at every backyard barbecue and Christmas dinner. I wish I could say the moment of decision came in some grand, cinematic way, a flash of anger, a lightning bolt of clarity, but really it came slowly, creeping in bit by bit until one day I realized there was no other choice that would let me look myself in the mirror. I thought back to when I was 16 years old, sitting at the kitchen table with my mom, while she tried to hide the stack of unpaid bills from me like I was too young to understand what past due meant. Dad had been laid off for the 3rd time that year, the factory jobs drying up one after another like puddles in a drought, and the house felt heavy with the kind of fear nobody ever says out loud, but everybody breathes in. It was around Christmas when Aunt Linda visited, her perfume thick and sharp enough to make your eyes water, her smile wide and fake as a politician's. I remember how she breezed in with a trunk full of gifts for Evan, all high-end electronics and designer clothes, while she handed my mom a grocery store fruit basket and said, loud enough for everyone to hear, "I figured you could use this. You know, since money's a little tight." The way she said tight, dragging it out like it was something dirty, made my stomach twist into a knot I can still feel if I think about it hard enough. Mom smiled, because what else could she do, and thanked her, because pride has to bow its head sometimes when there's nothing left to eat but dignity. But I saw the way her hands trembled when she set the basket on the counter. I saw the way she disappeared into the bathroom a few minutes later and stayed there long enough for me to hear the muffled sounds of crying through the thin walls. Aunt Linda had always dressed her cruelty up in the glitter of good intentions, making sure her insults came with a bow on top so she could act shocked and hurt when anyone pointed out the stink underneath. She was the queen of plausible deniability, a master at the kind of manipulation that leaves you doubting your own hurt. And she got away with it for years, because nobody wanted to be the one to call her out and risk the fallout. The endless passive-aggressive jabs, the whispered campaigns to paint you as ungrateful or bitter or just plain crazy. I carried that memory with me like a stone in my pocket, something small but heavy enough to drag at me when I least expected it. I carried it through high school, through college, through every lonely night in that crumbling apartment while I scraped together a future brick by stubborn brick. It stayed with me even as I tried to tell myself I didn't care what they thought, that their approval wasn't something I needed anymore. But that stone grew heavier when I saw her name on those contracts, when I realized that the same casual cruelty she used to humiliate my mom had been turned against people who had even less power to fight back. I could have ignored it. It would have been easy, cleaner, to pass the file up the chain and step away, to let someone else do the dirty work and pretend my hands were clean. Nobody would have blamed me. Hell, most people would have said it was smarter, safer, more professional. But every time I thought about letting it go, I saw my mom's face that night, tired, ashamed, trying so damn hard to smile through it, and I knew I couldn't. This wasn't about revenge, not really. It wasn't about getting even or settling old scores. It was about making sure that someone like Aunt Linda didn't get to keep winning just because she was good at pretending to be better than everyone else. It was about standing up, even if my knees were shaking, and saying, "Not this time." Of course, that didn't mean it didn't feel good, watching her read that letter, watching the realization sink in that the game had changed and she wasn't the one holding the cards anymore. I would be lying if I said there wasn't a dark, bitter satisfaction curling in my gut when her face paled, when her voice faltered, when the cracks in her perfect image spread like a spider web across glass. But satisfaction isn't the same thing as justice, and justice was what I was after, even if it cost me more than I could afford, even if it meant burning bridges I could never rebuild, even if it meant becoming, in their eyes, the villain of the story they told about themselves. Because in the end, it wasn't about whether they saw me as the bad guy. It was about whether I could live with myself if I didn't do what I knew was right. And standing there in that backyard, with the sun setting and the party slowly unraveling into a mess of confused whispers and sideways glances, I realized something else. Maybe justice isn't clean. Maybe it doesn't come in neat packages tied up with a moral bow. Maybe it's ugly and messy and full of moments where you wonder if you're becoming the very thing you hate. But even if it was ugly, even if it cost me whatever scraps of family goodwill I had left, it was still mine. My choice, my stand. And for the first time in a long, long time, I felt like I wasn't the afterthought anymore. I was the one pulling the strings now. And God help them if they thought I was going to stop at one letter. It didn't take long for the news to spread, seeping through the cracks of the family grapevine faster than any real disaster ever could. Whispered between phone calls and over backyard fences with the urgency and glee of people who secretly love watching a train wreck, as long as they aren't the ones trapped inside the wreckage. By the end of the week, the lawsuit wasn't just a rumor, it was a full-blown scandal. With Aunt Linda at the center and me painted neatly as the traitor who had thrown a grenade into the middle of Sunday dinners and Christmas mornings for no good reason but spite. The phone calls started first, little passive-aggressive missiles disguised as concerned questions from relatives I hadn't heard from in months, maybe years, suddenly very interested in my mental state and whether I had thought this through carefully. Cousin Tara called me late one night, voice dripping with fake sweetness, asking if maybe I had misunderstood the situation, if maybe there was another way to handle it that didn't involve dragging the family name through the mud. She sounded genuinely wounded, like the real tragedy wasn't that Aunt Linda had been robbing poor families blind, but that I had dared to point it out where other people might see. Even Uncle Rick, who had spent most of my life blending into the wallpaper behind Linda's loud personality, managed to summon the nerve to leave me a voicemail, a rambling, half-coherent message about loyalty and forgiveness and how family sticks together. Conveniently ignoring the fact that none of them had been too concerned about sticking by me when I was just the quiet kid in the corner trying to matter. It was as if they had all agreed, without even needing to say it out loud, that keeping the peace, keeping the illusion, was more important than facing the ugly truth sitting there in black and white for everyone to read. I wasn't surprised when the invitations to birthdays and barbecues stopped showing up, when family group chats that used to ping endlessly with useless memes and holiday plans suddenly went silent, like I had been surgically removed from the collective memory. I wasn't even surprised when Evan, Golden Boy Evan, called me one evening under the pretense of just wanting to talk, only to spend 20 minutes lecturing me about how I was hurting people who cared about me and letting bitterness ruin everything good in my life. "You're better than this, Jack," he said, voice tight with anger wrapped in disappointment, the kind of disappointment reserved for a dog that pissed on the carpet. "You don't have to burn everything down just to prove you exist." I didn't bother explaining it to him because deep down, I knew he would never get it. People like Evan, people who had spent their entire lives being loved without conditions, without question, had no frame of reference for what it felt like to be treated like an afterthought, a burden, a punchline. They couldn't understand the cold, gnawing ache of being invisible until the moment you made yourself impossible to ignore. But even knowing that didn't make it hurt any less when my own mother, the woman who had spent those long nights crying behind closed doors while Aunt Linda handed her charity wrapped in contempt, sat across from me at the kitchen table and asked, very quietly, if there was any way I could just drop it. "You've made your point," she said, not looking me in the eye, tracing the rim of her coffee mug with a trembling finger. "Maybe it's time to let it go, Jack. Maybe it's time to think about what this is doing to the family." The family. Those two words, so heavy with expectation and guilt, so loaded with the idea that love was supposed to mean swallowing your pride, your anger, your sense of justice, just to keep a broken thing from shattering completely. I stared at her across that faded wooden table, the same table where I had done my homework as a kid, the same table where she had balanced checkbooks and stretched grocery money until it snapped, and I felt something inside me fracture. I wanted to scream at her, to shake her, to demand why she would defend the very people who had humiliated her, who had looked down on her while pretending to help. I wanted to ask her why my loyalty was only called into question when it was directed at the truth instead of the lie they had all agreed to live under. But the words stuck in my throat, too big and jagged to force out without breaking something else between us. Instead, I pushed back my chair and stood up, the legs scraping loud against the worn linoleum floor, the sound sharp enough to make her flinch. "I'm not doing this for me," I said, my voice low and shaking, but steady enough that she couldn't pretend not to hear it. "And I'm sure as hell not doing it for them. I'm doing it because somebody has to." She looked at me then, really looked at me, and for a moment I thought maybe she saw it, maybe she understood, but then her gaze dropped back to her coffee, and the moment passed like smoke on the wind. I left without another word, stepping out into the sharp, cold air of a night that felt heavier than it should have, and for the first time in my life, I realized that sometimes blood isn't thicker than water at all. Sometimes it's just another chain wrapped around your ankles, trying to drag you back down into a place you barely survived escaping in the first place. And as I walked to my car, the gravel crunching under my boots, I knew something else with a kind of brutal clarity. Whatever happened next, whatever bridges burned or lines were drawn, I was already past the point of no return. They had made their choice. And so had I. The courthouse smelled like old wood and desperation, a mixture of dust, polished floors, and the kind of tension that clings to your skin no matter how many times you roll your shoulders or crack your knuckles. I sat there at the plaintiff's table, straight-backed and stone-faced, my hands folded neatly on the table in front of me like I had been taught in mock trial competitions, but my mind was anything but calm. The first hearing was mostly procedural, nothing flashy or dramatic like the movies would have you believe, but it still carried the electric weight of a starting gun, signaling that the real battle had begun and there would be no turning back. Across the aisle, Linda sat next to her defense attorney, a sharp-dressed man with dead eyes who looked like he had walked straight out of a billboard ad for injury lawyers you can trust, although everything about him screamed that you should do exactly the opposite. Linda was dressed in a muted gray suit, her hair pulled back tighter than I had ever seen it, as if she thought she could somehow tighten the strings on her life enough to hold it all together. When she saw me glance up, she did something that almost made me laugh out loud right there in the sterile courtroom air. She smiled. It wasn't a real smile, not even close, but the desperate, brittle kind you plaster on your face when you are trying to pretend you still have the upper hand, the kind that stretches too wide and shows too many teeth. I held her gaze for a beat longer than necessary, not smiling back, not blinking, just letting the silence between us thrum with all the things we both knew but could never say in a room full of lawyers and judges and legal clerks shuffling papers like the fate of small empires hung in the balance. The hearing moved slowly, painfully so, full of legal jargon and motions that had to be filed and counters filed, a procedural chess match that I knew was only a warm-up for the real blood sport to come. I listened, took notes, nodded when appropriate, all the while feeling the knot in my stomach tighten with each tick of the clock. From the corner of my eye, I could see Evan sitting on the defense's side of the gallery, his hands clasped between his knees, looking miserable in a suit that hung a little too loose on his athletic frame. Like even his body was unsure of how to behave when his perfect world cracked. When the hearing finally adjourned, the room exhaled in a collective, almost invisible sigh, a small easing of pressure before everyone gathered their papers and murmured their way toward the heavy double doors. I didn't hurry. I packed my briefcase methodically, feeling the weight of eyes on me, some curious, some judgmental, some simply confused by how easily a family could tear itself apart under the cold fluorescence of a courtroom. I was halfway down the courthouse steps when I heard Evan call my name, the sound sharp and raw against the dull roar of traffic and footfalls. I turned, slowly, bracing myself without even thinking about it, because whatever conversation was about to happen wasn't going to be easy or clean. Evan jogged up, his tie askew, the beginnings of panic or anger or maybe just exhaustion etched into the lines of his face, making him look older, less like the golden boy and more like a man who had just realized the ground under his feet was made of sand. "Jack, wait," he said, catching his breath and planting himself squarely in front of me, blocking the path like he could physically stop what had already been set into motion. "Can we just talk? Please?" I nodded, because whatever else we were, he was still family, still part of a past I couldn't completely sever no matter how much hurt lay tangled between us. We walked a little away from the steps, toward a corner of the courtyard where a couple of dying trees offered the illusion of privacy. Evan rubbed his hands together, fidgeting in that way he always had when he was nervous, like a kid trying to explain a broken lamp before his parents found out. "You don't have to do this," he said finally, voice low and urgent, the words tumbling out too fast. "You don't have to tear everything down. Look, whatever she did, I'm not saying it's okay, all right? I'm not saying it wasn't messed up. But this isn't just about her, Jack. It's about all of us. Mom, Dad, Nana June, you're hurting people who had nothing to do with it." I stared at him for a long moment, letting the words settle between us, feeling the familiar ache of being misunderstood gnawing at the edges of my resolve. Evan had always been good at seeing the big picture, at making people believe that compromise was the noble path, that swallowing your pride was the price you paid for keeping the family boat afloat. He believed it even now, standing there with desperation dripping off him like sweat. "You think I want to hurt anybody?" I said, my voice rougher than I intended. "You think this is some vendetta, Evan? This is about accountability. About consequences. About the people she screwed over because she thought no one would ever stand up and make her answer for it." Evan shook his head, frustration flashing across his face like a storm cloud. "But we're family, Jack. Family doesn't do this to each other." The words hit me harder than I wanted to admit, not because I believed them, not anymore, but because once, a long time ago, I had clung to them like a lifeline. Once, I had believed that family meant protection, loyalty, unconditional love. But all family really means, sometimes, is a set of expectations designed to keep you small, quiet, compliant. "No, Evan," I said quietly, each word deliberate and heavy as a stone. "Family doesn't do what she did. Family doesn't humiliate you when you're struggling. Family doesn't steal from people who have nothing left to give. Family doesn't laugh in your face when you finally succeed. Don't you dare stand there and tell me this is my fault." For a moment, we just stared at each other, the space between us filled with years of unspoken anger and pain and betrayal, the kind of wounds that don't bleed on the surface, but never really stop hurting. I saw something flicker in his eyes then, a tiny crack in the armor, but whether it was guilt or understanding or just more disappointment, I couldn't tell. Evan shoved his hands into his pockets, looking away like he couldn't stand the weight of what he saw in my face. I wish it didn't have to be this way," he muttered. "So do I said, and for once I meant it. But wishing didn't change anything. Wishing didn't erase what Linda had done, didn't undo the years of hurt or the lies or the quiet, grinding injustice. Wishing was for people who still believed in fairy tales. And I had stopped believing a long, long time ago. As I walked away, leaving Evan standing there under the brittle shade of a dying tree, I felt the familiar swell of conflict rise up inside me again, a twisted, burning knot of sadness and rage and grim determination. I didn't want to destroy my family, but I wasn't going to save them by letting them pretend nothing had ever been broken in the first place. By the time the third hearing rolled around, the faces around the courtroom had started to blur together into a single exhausted, judgmental mass, a sea of legal pads and cheap suits and restless sighs that barely masked the grinding fatigue of a battle that had gone on longer and messier than anyone had planned for. The lawsuit had grown arms and legs, sprouting new claims and counterclaims like weeds in an abandoned lot, dragging more and more into the open until the ugly underbelly of Aunt Linda's empire was laid out for everyone to see. No more polite smiles at family gatherings, no more whispered justifications about minor mistakes or harmless shortcuts. It was fraud, plain and simple, cold and deliberate, and there was no walking it back. The tenant testimonials were the hardest part to sit through, harder even than watching Linda squirm under cross-examination, her voice cracking as she tried to explain away forged documents and fake invoices. Listening to those tenants, people who had been bullied and cheated and left scrambling to find somewhere else to live when their homes were condemned over non-existent repairs, turned something hard and metallic inside me. These weren't just names on a file anymore. They were real people with real lives. And every single one of them carried a story that sounded painfully familiar to anyone who had ever been powerless and humiliated by someone who thought their money gave them the right to do whatever the hell they wanted. Every day that I sat there, listening, taking notes, fighting back the anger that threatened to spill out in ways that would only hurt the case, the old resentment I carried toward Linda evolved into something colder, something sharper. It wasn't about revenge anymore, and it wasn't even about justice in some noble, high-minded sense. It was about responsibility, about what you owed to the people who couldn't fight back, about what you owed to yourself when you knew the truth and chose not to look away. By the time we reached the settlement conference, Linda's side knew they were cornered. They had tried every trick in the book: delays, motions to dismiss, smears against the plaintiff's credibility, but the evidence was too solid, too damning, and the judge wasn't buying the desperate theatrics anymore. If the case went to verdict, Linda would lose everything. Her properties, her savings, even the gaudy McMansion she loved to flaunt every Thanksgiving like it was a trophy for best life performance. She would be lucky to crawl away with the clothes on her back and whatever dignity she could salvage from the wreckage. The offer came in a thick, heavy envelope, delivered to me personally outside the courtroom just before closing arguments were supposed to begin. It was a settlement, a chance for the tenants to get compensated without dragging through another 6 months of hell, a chance for Linda to surrender quietly without the spectacle of a public flogging. If I agreed to it, if I signed off on behalf of the plaintiffs, Linda would still be ruined financially, but not obliterated. She would keep a sliver of her estate, enough to live on modestly, enough to rebuild a life far away from the county where her name was now dirt. I stood there on the courthouse steps, envelope heavy in my hand, staring out at the flat, gray parking lot beyond like it might hold some answer if I just looked long enough. The sky was overcast, low and heavy, pressing down like a judgment of its own, and the cold October wind whipped at the edges of my coat, snapping the lapels against my chest. Inside the envelope was a signature away from finishing this war, from putting it all behind me. A signature away from showing I could be the bigger man, the one who didn't have to grind his enemy into dust just to prove a point. But it was also a signature away from letting her off easier than she deserved, from sparing her consequences she had spent years earning, dollar by stolen dollar. I thought about Evan's voice, still echoing in the back of my mind, pleading for mercy in the name of family. I thought about my mother, sitting across from me with pleading eyes, asking if it wasn't time to just let it go. I thought about the tenants who had nowhere to go when Linda had jacked up their rents and sent them eviction notices they couldn't fight. And I thought about all the times she had smiled at my pain, all the times she had laughed at my ambition, all the times she had acted like she was too big to ever fall. The wind picked up, scattering loose leaves across the courthouse steps, and I tightened my grip on the envelope, feeling the edges bite into my skin. It would be so easy to sign it, to end it, to walk away with a hollow kind of victory that nobody could question. It would be easy to tell myself that mercy was the higher road, that punishing her into oblivion would make me no better than the people who had spent years grinding others down for their own amusement. But easy isn't always right. And mercy, when given too cheaply, starts to look a lot like cowardice. I stood there for a long time, caught between two futures, one where I walked away and left a little of my anger buried like shrapnel in my chest forever, and one where I kept pushing, kept fighting, kept tearing down the illusions until there was nothing left but the bare, painful truth. Winning isn't always winning. Sometimes winning means losing pieces of yourself along the way, pieces you don't even realize are missing until you wake up one day and wonder how the hell you became someone you don't recognize. The courthouse door creaked open behind me, the noise sharp and jarring in the quiet afternoon, but I didn't turn around. I kept my eyes on the parking lot, the cracked concrete stretching out under the weight of 1,000 small decisions made by 1,000 people who probably thought they didn't matter at the time. I didn't sign the letter. And I didn't tear it up, either. I just stood there, the future teetering on the edge of my hand, knowing that no matter what I chose, there was no going back to the way things were before, no slipping quietly back into the family I had outgrown and outlasted and finally, painfully, outfought. Some of you might think I should have finished her off, signed the papers, crushed her without mercy the way she crushed everyone who got in her way. And some of you might think I should have walked away, let the past stay buried, salvaged whatever broken pieces of family still clung together like barnacles on a sinking ship. Maybe you're both right. Maybe you're both wrong. And maybe that's just how real life works. No clean victories, no simple answers, just the hard, messy business of trying to find your way through the wreckage with as much of your soul intact as you can manage. But standing there, envelope clutched tight in my fist, one thing was clear beyond a shadow of a doubt. Whatever came next, it was my choice. And nobody, not Aunt Linda, not Evan, not the ghosts of every family dinner where I sat invisible at the end of the table, was ever going to take that away from me again.